This is Christian Gomez with the New American Magazine, and today with us we have Tai Aguirre, the executive producer of the Expat show, which explores the lives of over 11 million Americans living abroad and overseas, and also he is the president of Taiko Productions. Tai, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you on today.
Mira, aprecio la invitación. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You're coming to us from New York, correct?
I do indeed, yes.
Okay, so you recently were in Colombia, and can you tell us a little bit about the nature of your trip while you were in Colombia and some of the things you saw there?
Originally to visit with expats. These are people from America, some from Canada. Not many in Colombia. As a matter of fact, even according to State Department figures, is probably less than 60,000. So what I did was, in my travels to Santa Marta and Pereira and Manizales, which is the Coffee Triangle, I met up with a lot of local Colombians of all ages. And they're so sweet. They really are. They're very authentic, I found, and they look you right in the eye. And that was my experience. So I ended up spending a lot of time with local Colombians.
And while you were down there, you captured some interesting footage. Let's take a look at that right now. Okay, so in this footage, we see here a group of lots of young people marching down the street. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of this video? Was this a protest?
Well, first of all, it was very interesting how I even got into this video. We were having I was at a restaurant in central Manizales. We're upstairs on the second floor, very nice little restaurant. All of a sudden, I thought there was a parade going by, and I had my little camera. I went to the window, and everybody was there and watched this protest. Very animated, very enthusiastic. And even though there were many, many young people, what I did find, Christian, is that of all ages seem to be plugged into what the issues are. And so I got to learn little by little about, I would say, the areas of irritation that brought this kind of protest on, which, as you know, is going on now throughout Colombia.
Yes, there's protests going on all across Latin America. We've had on the program a gentleman from Chile discussing the situation down there. We've seen protests in Bolivia with Evo Morales being thrown out of power, but this is happening all over the world, especially in Latin America. So what exactly is fueling these protests in Colombia? What are the issues that are getting people involved in the political movement, and what exactly are the objectives of these protesters? What do these young people and others that are protesting throughout Colombia, what are they seeking?
That's a great question. What I've learned is that it actually was about, remember, if we go back to, back in 2016, for example, FARC, which was the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, with the FARC, that organization seemed to, you call them Marxist-Leninists, but they seem to leech on. That seems to be the MO. They leech on to dissatisfaction. And that's what I got from this whole thing. And the issue really was many of the Colombians I spoke to, young and old, basically are saying that Uribe, or Duque, I should say, I'm thinking of Uribe, the last guy, but Duque, they criticize him because they feel that he's not really listening to the legitimate issues. Remember,
that's the president of Colombia, correct?
Correct. Yes, and remember back during the peace, what they call the peace negotiation with FARC, the agreement was they're going to lay down their arms if the government will address the infrastructure problems. Now, in my understanding, there's no question that Marxist-Leninist types of organizations reach on to these kinds of these areas, as I mentioned. But the thing is that what they're saying is that Duque is, instead of addressing the because there's no infrastructure to speak of renovation, and what the people feel, at least the ones I spoke with, are that he's just talking platitudes with them. In other words, what he's saying is, oh, well, I'm bringing tax breaks, I want to do this, but he's never really, the people feel this way anyway. that he's not addressing the real problems, the real questions, the real concerns of the people. And that's a complicated kind of thing because I want to say, the reason I also feel strongly, and what my impression was, Christian, of the people I spoke with, is when it comes to Marxist Leninists, remember, the Colombians, as you know, the Colombians got their independence from Spain in 1810. And
Simon Bolivar.
Simon Bolivar, that's true. He's all over the place. It's true. And the thing is this: remember, the Colombians that I certainly met, in large measure, are very religious, traditional, nationalistic, and they appreciate their freedom. That's a real underlying thing. Now, as far as the question in my mind, it was, well, is this a communist infiltration? It didn't make sense to me, and I'll tell you why. Because really, they're right next to Venezuela. And when I was in Santa Marta, the concern among business people that I spoke with there, and these are Colombian business people, is the unvetting of Venezuelans coming into the country, poor, taking over taxi jobs in the taxi industry, that kind of thing. So I think, again, it seems to me that Duque maybe, I shouldn't say this. Should I say? Well, I don't get that he's that intelligent to understand or that cognizant to understand what is fueling this. And
So do you think the President Duque, that do you think that he's naive then?
I do feel that way, and I may not be the only person that feels this way because he's been criticized as being inexperienced and not understanding. You know what it's like, Christian? It's almost like, having for example, you have a small business, crazy example, you have a small business in a place and you're being hassled by gang members, let's say. So what do? You turn to somebody that's going to give you, maybe you turn to the mafia and you say, listen, how do I get rid of these people that are hurting my business? And in a way, the people, from what I understand, all the people want to know is that Duque is listening and that he's really listening and that he's really going to do something. But there's only so much that I was able to, to learn from the time I was there. But it is a complex issue. And the last thing I want to say is that many of these civil groups now are joining in on the protests as well. So it's not just about infrastructure. Now it becomes a pension issue and other issues are coming in.
So are these young protesters, are they feeding into the propaganda of the FARC and even, which is probably coming out of Caracas and Venezuela? Are they feeding into that?
Well, it's a great question. I can't really say. I don't really know specifically, but those I spoke with are they're very passionate. They're very focused on the unfairness of the peace deal because it was a peace deal. And in 2016, it was a peace deal. And they feel that Duque is not living up to the peace deal, which is, as I mentioned, the Revolutionary Army of Colombia is going to lay down their arms and the government's got to do some work about the infrastructure. And when I went to Barranquilla, by the way, you can see the poverty. Now, what's interesting about the poverty is that the people don't seem to have a totally poverty mentality. They live their life. But there's some difficult things in Colombia, from my perspective, at least from what I've learned.
Do you think there's a risk or possibility, a realistic possibility, that if these protests ensue, that support for FARC could grow and that could lead to a kind of violent uprising or revolution in which FARC would be in a position to overthrow the Colombian state and government and replace it with what essentially would be a puppet regime for Venezuela, like we're seeing right now happening in Chile, like we have seen before with Bolivia and Nicaragua?
This is a very good point and a very good question. From what let me try to say this. I mean, it feeds into it, Christian. It really does. It's like people are going to gravitate towards groups that present a certain kind of empowerment. In other words, you know, hey, you're not alone. Um, in other words, you're not alone, Colombians. Uh, Come to FARC, come to our Marxist ideology. But again, I don't know how effective something like that would be because, at least in a small sense of what I've learned from the people I spoke with, again, they're very aware of the failure of Venezuela. You know, again, again, I spoke to, but a number of people, but locally.
If only more American college students were familiar with those failures, they might be less inclined to join groups like Antifa and support candidates like Bernie Sanders, who would surely bring about a Venezuelan type situation if they could.
Well, that's a great question, and I want to just say, without blowing smoke, uh, it's a tremendous thanks to the New American and your organization that has been teaching the truth behind some of the issues. And not only that, but it's the communication and the technology we have today, in my view, that is making this scenario of going communist or going collectivist. Of course, my research is telling me that behind this is a global fascist kind of leadership behind these groups, the communist groups. But I feel positive about it because I think the people, again, have this, in Colombia anyway, have this very strong nationalistic, it's a pride. With Yo soy colombiano. I mean, it's like that, you know?
And they won't allow their country to become a puppet regime, a satellite for Venezuela. The people of Colombia are too smart to let their country fall into the hands of those who would basically enslave them. So there's hope for Colombia, and Lord willing, there can be hope for Americans as well, and not to be fooled into the lie of Marxism.
Well, we have the internet, we have organizations like you, and people can, that's true, people can get information. And more, especially in the US, as you know, um, this technology, this social media, this kind of access to information beyond the mainstream has really, and I think will really be a saving grace.